Hello. Hello and welcome to the 8th annual Analytic Theology lecture at AAR. I'm going to apologize for my voice. I do not have the plague. I'm at the tail end of a cold, and that's how these things go for me. I'm really happy to see you all here, especially since our session was left out of the printed program book. This lecture series is sponsored by the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. I'm Michael Ray, one of the directors of the center. Today's lecture will, as usual, be followed by a reception from 4:30 p.m. until 6, which will be held right next door in Colorado F. All of you are welcome and encouraged to attend. Please note there's also a book table at the back where you can get at least Lauren's latest book and maybe others, I'm not sure. So our speaker today is Lauren Winner. She is the Associate Professor of Christian Spirituality at Duke Divinity School and the Vicar of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lewisburg, North Carolina. Her graduate training was in early American history, and her first academic monograph was a study of everyday religious practice in the lives of 18th century Virginia Anglicans, a study that considered, among other things, the kinds of bowls Virginia babies were baptized in and the mourning jewelry they wore when bereaved. She's probably better known for her spiritual memoirs, Girl Meets God, and Still, for her writing in Books and Culture, whose demise she still mourns, and for her prize-winning 2015 book, Wearing God, which examined overlooked biblical metaphors for the Lord. In recent years, she has turned her attention more fully to theology, and last month, Yale University Press published her study, The Dangers of Christian Practice, which argues that the last 40 years of discourse about Christian practice has pristinated practice and failed to bring an adequately robust appreciation of sin to practice talk. We'll be hearing a bit from that book this afternoon. When I invited her to give this lecture, Lauren's initial response was one of puzzlement. Analytic theologian is not among the labels she ordinarily applies to herself. So Tom Wright might have said last year, so Sarah Coakley might have said the year before that. But as those who have watched the world of analytic theology grow over the past decade will know, analytic theology as an idea and a kind of movement is most fundamentally about bridge building and expanding the scope of our theological conversations. It is about blurring disciplinary boundaries rather than drawing and defending them. It is about bringing analytic philosophers into dialogue with different quarters of theology: historical theology, biblical studies, liberation theology, and today, the theology of Christian spirituality and practice. Lauren's theological work, particularly Wearing God and the Dangers of Christian Practice, is very much in step with cutting-edge work in analytic theology. And so analytic theologians will naturally want to make it part of our conversation. And so now we hear from Lauren Winner. The title of her talk is The Eucharist, Perfection, and Damage.
Thank you. So I have rarely felt so inadequately qualified to address a group of people as I feel to address a group of analytic theologians. As Mike said, when I first received the invitation to be here about 14 months ago, I did two things when I first got that invitation. First, I emailed Mike and literally asked, "Are you sure you have the right person?" And he kindly said he did. And the second thing I did was I walked around for 3 days mapping out a Lacanian and Winnicottian reading of the Eucharist because I mistakenly thought that the term analytic theology denoted not the nexus of Christian theology and principles from analytic philosophy, but rather the nexus of Christian theology and psychoanalysis. I sort of wish I had the nerve to deliver the talk I would have written if I hadn't been corrected, Wouldn't that have been cool if I'd come here sort of dazedly offered you my thoughts about what we see in the Eucharist if we put it under the pressure of Winnicott's notion of the transitional object? That would be a cool paper, but I do not have the nerve to do that. So when I wrote Mike to make sure he had the right person, he explained that some years this group does invite a leading analytic theology person to give the lectures, and that some years you have exactly invited someone from another field, hoping that person would put her own concerns up alongside analytic theology and that everyone would learn something from the juxtaposition. I want to note that kind of invitation extending is pretty remarkable. It's not completely unique, but I do think it's all too rare in our contemporary academic landscape. To extend such an invitation, the inviter has to have a certain posture, a rare combination of humility and evangelistic zeal. It shows something pretty wonderful about this group that you want to invite other people to talk to you. So after I accepted the invitation, and after I learned that the invitation I'd accepted did not involve Lacan, I began to read some analytic theology things. Mostly I read the things that my dear friend Andrew Schignell told me to read. Now, usually when I picked up these things that Andrew recommended, it was as though I was trying to read a book in Swedish, a language I don't know at all. And yet, I had a year to give a talk, if not actually in Swedish, somehow alongside Swedish, a talk that somehow gazed in the direction of Sweden, and the audience would be native Swedish speakers. I should say clearly that despite my dutifully reading these things that Andrew sent me, I don't presume to know how to ask a question in Swedish, or how to shape an argument in Swedish, or what constitutes evidence in Swedish. Nonetheless, through my reading, I did learn a few things. I learned, for example, that there are people out there who think that a cocktail of Aristotle, Thomism, and phenomenology is not adequate to the task of robust, philosophically informed theology. That there are people out there who see that Anglophone analytic philosophy, with its characteristic care for propositional statements and persuasiveness of argument based on propositional translucence, that this is the philosophical disposition that should be brought to bear on Christian theological questions. I thought to myself, what would I do in this talk if I wanted to be loved by analytic theologians? And it seemed to me as I read that you would want me to state with as much precision as possible and as little ambiguity as possible exactly what I was arguing. Possibly you would want me to state my argument in a series of numbered propositions. And I began to see that you would love a speaker who could display that paramount intellectual virtue of clarity. Well, I don't think of myself as an especially clear thinker. And I don't even really think of myself as making arguments all that often. And I like ambiguity. But I appreciate a certain impatience that I have found in analytic theology. Impatience with things that seem to be distractions. If I were to make a list and an analytic theologian were to make a list of what is a distraction, our lists might not be the same. It seems to me that analytic theology might put on that list offering exegetical arguments that try to get clear about what other people think. And I'm not sure that I would include that on my list of distractions. But in a way, both virtuous and vicious, I share the stance of impatience toward that which seems to distract from whatever one takes to be the heart of the matter. So I'm glad to have received this invitation, and I'm specifically glad to have received it when I did, and not even 3 years earlier, and here's why. I've spent most of the last 20 years writing in some form or fashion about the category of Christian practice. I have written about the things that we typically class as Christian practices, things like fasting or Sabbath keeping or praying. And I have written about less obvious things like 18th century Anglican girls' needlework, which I've argued should be read not only as training in housewifery, but also as a practice of religious catechesis. Over the years, I've been wedded to the commonplace dichotomy between belief and practice. In recent years, I've started to think that this dichotomy isn't really very helpful. But for many years, I was committed to it, and for reasons both polemical and biographical, I insisted that belief wasn't really very interesting. So you can see that I wasn't reading a lot of analytic theology. I'm glad to have been reading in this field exactly this past year and not, say, 5 years ago, because it meant my reading could encompass the recent rich discussion by analytic theologians of liturgy. Principally, it could encompass Nicholas Walterstorff's Acting Liturgically and Terence Cuneo's Ritualizing Faith. Liturgical practice, most centrally various aspects of baptismal and Eucharistic practice, have long been important in my field of concerns. But again, when I have come at the topics of the Eucharist and baptism, I've come with somewhat different interests than analytic theologians who write about them. In the discussion of baptism in Ritualized Faith, Cuneo, that's not right. Is that right, Cuneo? Okay, I practiced pronouncing his name. Cuneo, I actually wrote it out phonetically in my talk. Cuneo analyzes several paragraphs of words from the Eastern Orthodox baptismal rite. When I've written about baptism, I've more typically written about 18th and 19th century baptismal gowns. And when I turn to written texts, the texts I turn to are sometimes the words of the Anglican liturgy for baptism, but they're just as often the instructions found in 19th century etiquette guides of whom to invite to the baptismal party you throw in your drawing room. Despite these divergent archives, when I found myself a few months ago standing at the corner where liturgy and analytic theology intersect, I felt happy. So what I'm going to do for the next half hour is say some things specifically about what I take Cuneo to be doing in ritualized faith, and then step through a door that he cracks open to offer an additional argument about liturgy. Embedded in all of that will be a few questions that I have for and about analytic theology, questions I hope that you can answer for me during our Q&A time or during the reception. I should say first that I loved this book, Ritualized Faith. Have people here read, raise your hand if you have read Ritualized Faith or some of the articles it collects. Okay, a handful of us. So I loved it, and I feel very grateful to it. For those of you who've not yet read it, it's a collection of previously published essays, all of which examine Eastern Orthodox liturgical life. Among other things, it offers readings of specific liturgical actions like kissing icons and baptizing. It draws on Gilbert Ryle to account for the kind of knowing that liturgical performance requires. It notes that liturgies often ask us to reenact core aspects of the Christian story, often by repeating the words of or in some other way identifying with characters from the Bible. And it argues that through this identification with biblical characters, the liturgy is inviting us to construct new narrative selves that are grounded in a commitment to the biblical people whose speech we have just appropriated. Something I've struggled to articulate, I still don't think I can articulate this very well, is how would you know that ritualized faith is an analytic theology account? In some ways, of course, you would know. There is an obvious internal polemic in this book, and it's super fun to eavesdrop on other communities' polemics. So I was very attentive to those polemical passages, as when, after a lengthy discussion of Plantinga's warranted Christian belief, Cuneo writes, Christianity is not a body of propositions. Its fundamental aim is not to produce agents that form warranted beliefs about God. So I know enough about analytic theology to know that in analytic theology, those are fighting words, and you know you're reading analytic theology polemic. But there were whole stretches where I was unable to articulate how analytic theology, or even philosophy more generally, was being brought to bear. For example, take the book's wonderful chapter on why liturgical texts are best sung. The chapter argues that much of Eastern Orthodox liturgy calls for people to sing words about shalom or about irene, and that when the corporate singing works the way it wants to work, the act of corporate singing knits people together in a collective action and in real-time responsiveness that enacts and enables the singers to experience some of the shalom being sung about. I have some quibbles with this chapter. Chiefly, the chapter made me wonder, and maybe you can tell me at the end of the talk why analytic theology and phenomenology don't get together. The account of singing the Psalms in ritualized faith is a rich one, but it seems like it would only be made richer by a proper phenomenological reduction of sung psalms. But for the moment, I simply want to observe that at the end of the chapter, Cuneo notes, in drawing attention to the experimental and experiential dimension of liturgical singing, I have entered into the territory occupied by discussions of religious experience. Philosophers of religion have not ignored religious experience, he writes. On the contrary, some of the most probing discussions in the contemporary literature concern it. But almost always, these discussions concern mystical or uncanny religious experience. In contrast, writes Cuneo, the experience he is getting at in liturgical singing is, he says, fairly common. It is a religious experience that belongs to the unduly neglected category of ordinary religious experience. Now, this again is obviously internal polemic. It's an argument maybe with Bill Alston. But to me, it reads like something that might have been written in the field of my own first disciplinary training, that is American religious history, which has for the last 20 years been concerned with so-called lived religion, a term popularized in the landscape of American religious history by David Hall and Bob Orsi. It's a term that designates the practices that are practices not of religious rapture or clerical expertise, but rather ordinary religious experience, often the ordinary religious experience of lay people, the practice of cooking meatless meals on Friday, the practice of lighting Hanukkah candles and spinning dreidels, the practice of singing hymns. It seemed to me that the plumping for attention to ordinary religious experience that we find in ritualized faith was virtually indistinguishable from the plumping that you find from American cultural historians. Of course, then I would come to sentences like this. Roughly stated, the moderate view tells us that to know how to perform some act fying is to stand in a knowing or understanding relation to a way of fying. And when I came to sentences like that, I knew that I was reading analytic theology because you don't get Greek symbols in the middle of sentences in lived religion monographs. One thing I appreciate about Cuneo is his repeated insistence that the claims he is making are, and this is his phrase, unapologetically normative. The logic of the practice of collective psalm singing ought to lead practitioners into an experience of shalom, he argues. He doesn't argue that collective singing of the songs actually or necessarily does in fact lead to that experience of shalom. Or, regarding liturgical reenactment of the stories of biblical characters, he writes, and here I'm quoting, "The construction of a narrative identity is among the activities that the liturgical script calls for." This is a welcome improvement over the post-liberal Wittgensteinians that I've been reading on liturgy and ethics for the past 15 years. For all their many insights, they frequently cast normative claims in descriptive language. So one can read them and come away with the impression that the Eucharist, in fact, produces a politics of peace and hospitality, a sort of Eucharist ex machina that combats malforming practices of capitalism and militarism. Ritualized faith would argue that Eastern Orthodox liturgical scripts call for this or that. They call for the remission of sin, or they call for the experience of peace. But the book doesn't make claims about what actually happens when people take up the Eastern Orthodox liturgical scripts. This is a welcome reserve, though I think it doesn't go far enough. Indeed, I want to dwell in the book's occasional provisos. There is a phrase that the author is fond of. When all goes well, he often writes, or textual variants of that phrase. When all goes well, liturgical activities like the Eucharist contribute over time to sin's releasing its grip on us, or about the liturgical blessing of water. The upshot is that ritual activities such as the blessings of the waters has the effect, when things go moderately well, of honing one's sensibilities in such a way that one begins to view, experience, and treat matter differently than one would in one's day-to-day life. The book uses provisos like this at least half a dozen times, and the phrase, of course, implies that things don't always go well. The book also notes on a few occasions that there is, quote, empirical evidence, a phrase which I take to mean evidence gathered ethnographically or historically about the moral and political lives of liturgical practitioners. There is empirical evidence that liturgical scripts don't always go the way they normatively might. Now, in all fairness, the space cracked open by these provisos is not the book's central interest. Since analytic theologians are newly turning their attention to the dynamics of practice, they are, of course, most prone to notice the ways that practice is supposed to work, rather than the ways it does work. But I still think it's worth noting the way in which ritualized faith's account is inadequate. And I'd like you to listen carefully to a few sentences from the book about liturgical reenactment. This, again, on the book's terms, is what happens when the liturgy prompts us to somehow identify with or represent the speech of biblical characters, like the prodigal son or Mary of Bethany. Quote, "It belongs to the essence of this liturgical reenactment that the assembled commit themselves to ethical and religious ideals of various sorts, such as being like Mary of Bethany. Of course, we have excellent empirical evidence that in a large range of cases, these ideals do not take. But when they do not take, the failure is of a distinct kind. It is a failure to live up to the standards to which an agent has committed herself in the context of liturgical action." So what that passage that I just read is saying is that when the moral formation that a particular liturgical script fails to take, the failure is a failure of the agent to live up to the standards to which she has committed herself through the performance of the liturgy. I would rather say that when liturgy goes wrong, sometimes the problem lies with an agent who has failed to live up to something. But sometimes the failure lies in the form of the liturgical rite itself. There are failures that the rite disposes its participants toward, and that is an additional kind of failure. Cuneo makes it sound like you have liturgical acts that go along like a beautiful ship on the water. And sometimes the participants, the passengers on the ship, don't go along well enough with the ship. They fall off. But the ship itself is already not what it should be. The ship itself is already damaged by sin, as it's a matter of Christian doctrine to say everything but God and maybe Mary and maybe the human nature of Jesus, if you want to talk about that as being distinct from God, everything but those things, it's a matter of Christian doctrine to say, is damaged by sin. When all goes well, immersing oneself in liturgical action might expand our powers of moral understanding, the book argues. When all goes well, Eucharistic activity contributes over time to the release of the grip of sin on Eucharistic practitioners. But things never can go completely well because sin has damaged all things. The Provisos in the book recognize that the liturgical ideal is often not realized. I want to push that recognition so that we don't only recognize that the ideal is not realized, but that we also recognize an indigenous possibility of the brokenness of the liturgical practices themselves. So this book, Ritualized Faith, does a marvelous job of giving accounts of specific goods that certain liturgical practices characteristically want to and sometimes do extend. For example, the claim that liturgical singing characteristically wants to bring about an experience of the peace that the liturgical texts sung proclaim, or the claim that the Eucharist characteristically wants to bring about the good of releasing sin's grip on partakers of the Eucharist. What I'm suggesting is that we should pay equal attention to the specific ways that liturgical practices are damaged and extend damage. When a practice, any kind of practice, not just a liturgical practice, when a practice exhibits or brings about damage, sometimes those damages are, or at least seem to us to be, arbitrary. They seem only coincidentally related to the practice. But other instances of practice damage are not arbitrary. They are intimately related to the practice itself. They are deformations of the form of the practice. They are inversions of the specific good the practice offers. They are characteristic of the practice. All practices have these characteristic goods and characteristic damage, and the latter is precisely a distortion of the former. That's one reason that characteristic damage is interesting. Arbitrary damage doesn't tell us very much about the damaged thing, but characteristic damage, because it is precisely a distortion of the form and goods of the thing in question, can help us see what the form and goods of a thing are. It is, for example, characteristic of large-scale tobacco farming in 18th century Virginia to require debt. The indebtedness of the planters tells us something about the deep structure of the farming they undertook, and it tells us something about the planters' love of luxury. It is characteristic of modern academia that its participants get corrupted by pride. Pride is a corruption that tells us something about what academia is. Sometimes an academic becomes damaged by the flu, but that is a damage that is not obviously about academia and seems to be extrinsic to it. But some instances of damage are characteristic of the thing and proper to it. Take the example of a novel. Novels can be damaged by sentimentality, by which I mean, following the poet Mark Doty's definition, the condition that obtains when the writer feels more than the reader feels about the subject of or the characters who animate the book. Novels are not the only things that turn sentimental, and not all novels do, but the lapse into sentimentality is a familiar way for novels to become damaged. And that damage is about the thing that a novel is. It is a kind of damage that is intimate with the goods a novel offers. The novelist would not have set out to write a novel about alienation from the land in the postbellum American South if he hadn't felt deeply about it. And now it turns out he feels more deeply than you do. And in fact, he wants to force your feelings into the shape of his own, and because novels are by definition long, the author has many opportunities to express his deep feelings and try to manipulate yours. This is an intelligible and predictable way for novels to be damaged. It is not a particularly intelligible way for rose bushes to be damaged, or anti-lock brakes, or a catnap. But it makes good sense for a novel to go wrong in just this way. Or consider a meal. What is a meal? We might say that a meal is a ritualized and regulated social act in which the actors consume food. Certain goods attend meals. Meals, for example, bind together the people who are eating them. The people you eat with are the people you belong to. That's a characteristic good of a meal. In meals eaten by the specific communities we call families, meals can have a secondary good. They are places where parents socialize and exercise authority over their children. Those are some of the goods that meals can characteristically express. They can foster belonging, and they can offer an opportunity for parents to socialize their kids. But meals can also characteristically express damage. A meal can be deformed by its exclusions. By excluding, it tells us something about a meal. One of the things meals do is define and bind communities, but that binding and defining can easily slip into exploitation and exclusion and the reification of boundaries. Parents exercise authority over kids at meals, but that authority can lead to a child's being forced to sit for 17 hours until she cleans her plate, and 10 years later, her therapist will trace her eating disorder back to the parental exercise or parental misuse of prandial authority. These are characteristic ways that meals can be deformed. They are deformations that are intimate with the form and goods of a meal. A meal could also be damaged by the arrival of an armed robber who steals the guest of honor's poodle. That would be a kind of damage extrinsic to the meal. The armed robber wanted the poodle and would have been just as happy to interrupt a card game or a walk in the park to get it. Things become deformed by sin in ways that are proper to the thing being deformed. And when those deformations have consequences, you can't separate the consequences from the deformed thing itself, because it belongs to the thing potentially to have those very consequences. When we read Christian practices under the pressure of the basic doctrinal axiom that nothing apart from God is exempt from the damage produced by the fall, then we can see that deformations of Christian practice are part of the practices themselves. So I'd like to give a historical example that I believe we might all agree, I hope we all agree, maybe we won't all agree, is an instance of the liturgy not going well. It's an instance of the liturgy going badly. And then I'd like to invite us to think about how that liturgical action's characteristic goods have been perverted into this particular characteristic damage. To that end, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about medieval episodes known as host desecration narratives. And my historical account will draw principally on the work of historian Miri Rubin. Beginning in the late 13th century, Christians began to tell stories in which Jews had procured a consecrated Eucharistic wafer and attempted to destroy it. These accusations functioned a bit like charges of rape leveled against African American men in the late 19th and early 20th century South. The charges were false, but they were used to justify killing the one who was accused. In the case of medieval Christian violence against Jews, Christians usually killed the individual Jew accused of procuring and trying to destroy the host. Christians often killed a handful of other neighboring Jews, and sometimes they massacred whole Jewish communities. The murderous Christians might then raze the accused Jew's house, or sometimes raze a local synagogue, and then the Christian community would erect a chapel in the Jewish building's place. These chapels were dedicated to the miraculous survival of the host. Pilgrims came to give thanks for the miracle of the supposedly violated host's survival, and to pray in the presence of associated implements like the knife that the Jews supposedly used to destroy the wafer, and sometimes to pray in the presence of the host itself. The first fully worked out host desecration narrative that we know about happened in Paris in 1290. On Easter of that year, an economically marginal Christian woman runs to get her parish priest. She tells him that a Jew she knows had persuaded her to pocket the consecrated wafer she received on Easter morning. She delivered it to him, and he then tried to destroy the wafer. As summarized by Miri Rubin, it was said that the man struck the wafer with a knife, but it remained intact and began to bleed. He then picked up a hammer and anvils and pierced it through, but again, the host remained whole and bleeding. He threw it into a fire, hoisted it on a lamp, and attempting final destruction, threw it into a cauldron of boiling water. The water turned red, and the host was transformed into a crucifix, which hovered above the cauldron. The woman went running to her priest with this tale, and the priest summoned his bishop. The Jew was then turned over to civil authorities and burned to death. His wife and children converted to Christianity. That was 1290. I'd like us to notice two things about the era in which these host desecration accounts began to take hold in Europe. First, this was an era when the Eucharist was of preeminent importance in the devotional lives of Western Christians. The Eucharist was the sacramental center of people's encountering God. And relatedly, this was also a moment where there was a lot of energy devoted to hammering out accounts of what was happening at the Eucharist. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 was concerned, among other things, with both Eucharistic teaching and Eucharistic practice. Lateran IV required the faithful to make an annual confession and to receive the sacrament of the Eucharist at least on Easter. At the level of doctrine, Lateran IV defined transubstantiation as de fide. To be clear, the conciliar declaration of transubstantiation does not tell us that the discussion of the how of the Eucharist either began or ceased at Lateran IV. It simply tells us that questions of Eucharistic mechanics were sufficiently in the air that the Pope believed a conciliar definition was warranted. So that's one thing to notice about the era in which host desecration narratives and their attendant violence emerged. It was a time of great Eucharistic energy at both the level of liturgical practice and the level of doctrinal formation. The second thing to notice about the era is that it was a time when Christians were especially concerned with theorizing their relation to Jews. We don't have time for a detailed discussion of this, but suffice it here to say that this theorizing was not unrelated to the Eucharist. Insofar as bonds of unity are predicated on another's exclusion, Jewish bodies which stood apart from the Eucharistic body could be drafted to serve Christian proclamation about Christian Eucharistic unity, about the liturgical and social body of Christ. Indeed, in the 12th century, thinking about the Eucharist became, for Christians, a task that was intimate with the task of solving problems about the Jewish bodies in their midst. Just what did it mean to say that God had become man? And what did it mean to say that Christians could commune with him through the host? How could the Jewish body of Jesus be represented for the salvation of Gentile bodies? In Christians' minds, Jews lurked around seemingly internal theological debates. For Christian unity, which was premised on chewing and swallowing the body of Christ, seemed to have no room for the Jews who simultaneously denied and murdered that body. Also, of course, Jews were a living reminder that it was possible to not believe the claims the church made about the body of Jesus of Nazareth, either that his first century body was an incarnation of God or that his body was somehow present in Eucharistic bread and wine. Christian worries about Jews and Christian worries about the Eucharistic representation of Jesus surface in a coincident manner in Lateran IV. In addition to defining transubstantiation as an article of the faith, Lateran IV also devoted attention to regulating Jewish bodies. For example, demarcating sartorial codes for Jews. Concern about Eucharistic practice and the interactions between Jews and Christians in real space-time came together in the second paragraph of Canon 68. In the passage that I'm about to read from Canon 68, you'll hear the pronoun they. Textual context suggests that the they refers to both Muslims and Jews, but given the religious geography of medieval Europe, it probably referred in practical terms mostly to Jews. From Lateran IV, during the last 3 days before Easter, and especially on Good Friday, they shall not go forth in public at all, for the reason that some of them on these very days do not blush to go forth better dressed, and are not afraid to mock the Christians who maintain the memory of the most holy passion by wearing signs of mourning. This injunction aims to keep derisive Jews away from pious Christians. on the days when Christians recall the Last Supper and the execution of Jesus. And in this injunction, we see a trope that recurs throughout church documents in the 13th century: restriction of Jews' movement in public space, segregation of Jews from Christians on holy days, the suggestion that Jews will mock the beliefs of pious Christians. Over the next few decades, councils and synods across Europe continued to intone that Jews were to dress differently from Christians, they were not to have sex with Christians, they weren't to live near Christians, and they were to keep away from Christians when Christians were in the presence of the body of their Lord. In Avignon in 1243, all Jews over the age of 9 were instructed to hide away whenever a host was paraded in public. The 1267 Synod of Vienna said that Jews were to stay indoors when a Eucharistic procession passed by, lest the clever Jews talk trash about the Eucharist and confuse their simpler Christian neighbors. Much more could be said about Christian reflection during the 12th and 13th centuries on Jews, but suffice it for this hour to say that we see in the 12th and early 13th centuries an increased devotional attention to the Eucharist, and we see the discursive interleaving of Christian concerns about the Eucharist with Christian concerns about Jews. In the late 13th century, these interleavings turned more violent. Christians' accusations that Jews had procured a consecrated host and tried to destroy it became the discursive basis and the energizing rationale for Christians to kill their Jewish neighbors, burn down Jewish buildings, and replace those buildings with chapels devoted to Eucharistic miracles. The first fully documented case of host desecration, that case in Paris, occurred 75 years after Lateran IV. In the following centuries, similar tales of host desecration would be told, and similar violence would ensue across Europe. A partial list of such violences include outbreaks in Polkau in 1338, outside of Vienna in 1421. There, the Jews who didn't kill themselves or convert were burned on the banks of the Danube. A host desecration outbreak and violence in Breslau in the 1450s, in Regensburg in the 1470s. Sometimes, as in the Paris case, only one Jew or a small number of Jews was killed. Sometimes regional massacres followed in the wake of host desecration accusations. In 1298 in Röttingen, for example, 21 Jews were killed after rumors of a host desecration circulated, and those events sparked a wave of violence that eventually killed 3,000 people and destroyed 146 communities. Historian Mitchell Murbach summarizes that in the southern reaches of the German Empire in the 2 centuries before the Reformation, host desecration, quote, shattered the patterns of Ashkenazic life. By the middle of the 14th century, brutal religious riots in these regions had claimed thousands of innocent lives, with the host legend playing loudly in the background. Indeed, the usefulness of host desecration charges proceeded long past the Middle Ages. As Magda Tater has argued, in Reformation-era Poland, host desecration charges and violence flourished, taking on a new polemical meaning. Such charges were no longer a tool for navigating only the boundary between Christians and Jews. They were also a tool of Christian differentiation in an era of competing religious reforms. New host desecration accusations circulated in Poland through the 16th century, and older host desecration stories were ritually recalled and revived with a new vigor at memorial chapels whose Catholic agents sought to attract pilgrims and retain the religious attentions of men and women who might be tempted by Protestantism. In Poznan, for example, a 1399 host desecration episode was seen to have new salience after the Diet of Augsburg. In the context of Protestant growth, it was no longer only Jews who denied the ontology of the Eucharist. Protestants did so too. So in the 16th century, the local legend of a 1399 host desecration was revivified and embroidered as a way of navigating the Protestant Catholic debate and as a way of drawing the visitors to the Carmelite church that had been built in the place where the Jews accused of the original host desecration had lived. At least until the 1920s, worshipers at that Carmelite church proclaimed not the traditional Kyrie eleison, In the Eucharistic Mass, they rather proclaimed the following prayer. O Jesus, unsurpassed in your goodness, stabbed by Jews and soaked in blood again, through your new wounds and spilled springs of blood, have mercy on us. Kyrie eleison. Continuing the prayer, the hearts of stone from the Jew street sank their knives into you in the three hosts, the eternal God. Have mercy on us, have mercy on us, have mercy. A prayer said through the 1920s. So to review, for centuries in Western Europe, the preeminent sacramental and devotional action of Christians was an essential element in the Church's violence against Jews. This is one piece of empirical evidence that we can push into the fissure cracked open by ritualized faith's implication that liturgical things do not always go well. It is, to be sure, not inevitable that the Eucharist turns violent, but when violence against Jews is sponsored by host desecration accusations and authorized by the Eucharist, that violence is not connected to the Eucharist by happenstance. The violence rather depends on the centrality and fecundity of the Eucharistic symbol. Medieval host desecration violence was not incidentally Eucharistic. It was intrinsically Eucharistic. What I want to ask is, what is it about the Eucharist that so easily allowed the sacrament to fund violence against Jews? What is the form of the Eucharist, and how does that form deform, and what do the Eucharist form and deformations have to do with the history of Eucharistically funded toxicity in medieval and early modern Europe? In offering one possible answer to those questions, I am moving from the register of historical account to the register of interpretive and suggestive juxtaposition. I am not arguing that when medieval Christians received the Eucharist, they often or ever thought per se in terms of Jewish flesh, nor am I arguing that there is a straightforward causal relation between, say, Lateran IV and host desecration narratives. Rather, I am juxtaposing theological questions with social and liturgical practice with the aim of showing affinities. In pondering host desecration violence, it is productive to think about the Eucharist as a place of great intimacy between Christ's Jewish flesh and Christians' principally Gentile flesh. Lateran IV's articulation of transubstantiation as an article of the faith, its regulations governing the interactions and encounters of ordinary Jews and Christians, and various locales' subsequent reiteration and augmenting of those regulations may be seen as dilations on a set of questions. How are or are not Jewish bodies and Christian bodies to be intimate? How can Christians be intimate with the Jewish body of Christ when they are plagued by the nearness of Jewish bodies that in Christian accounts denied that body's divinity, killed it, and now mock its mournful devotees? How can Christians best guard against undue intimacy with Jewish bodies while still organizing their devotional life around intimacy with the Eucharistic Jewish body of Jesus Christ? The overlappings of those questions at Lateran IV and in the decades and centuries after the Fourth Lateran Council suggest the usefulness of thinking about Eucharistic practice during the era of host desecration narratives with the postulate that there was slippage between Jews' bodies and the body of Christ, that there was a lurking anxiety about Jesus, the Jew with a body who becomes the Christ with a perfect body, a body he offers for the sins of man. The murder of the Jew in Paris and the murder of other Jews snared by host desecration tales may be seen as the Church's response to a problem it perceived about the relations among Christians' Gentile bodies, the Jewish bodies of their neighbors, and the Jewish body of Jesus. So what is the form of the Eucharist? We might say that fundamental to the Eucharist is the reception of the Jewish flesh of Jesus by the typically Gentile bodies of Christians. Except in the now rare instances where the gathered church comprises only baptized Jews, without the reception of the Jewish flesh of Jesus by the Gentile bodies of Christians, you do not have a Eucharist. The Eucharist is the consecration of bread and wine, so that the bread and wine can be consumed as the body and blood of Jesus by the faithful. That is the form of the Eucharist, and it has characteristic goods and characteristic deformations. The principal characteristic good of the Eucharist is conformity to and intimacy with Jesus through ingestion. One of its characteristic deformations is a set of attitudes toward and practices about living Jewish flesh, a deformation that is predictable, precisely because the Eucharist is about Jewish flesh and about the kinds of claims that Christians make about the particular Jewish flesh of Jesus. When something goes wrong with the Eucharist, that wrongness may unsurprisingly touch Jewish bodies, because the Eucharist's aboutness is Christian bodies consuming a Jewish body. This is obviously not to say that the Eucharist must lead to host desecration charges and the murder of Jews. It is only to say that the Eucharist funding violence against Jews is intelligible. The Eucharist becomes the moment when the church is most intimate with Jewish flesh. It is the moment when the church's faithful consume Jewish flesh. It is not unforeseeable that one of the Eucharist's characteristic deformations is the consumption of Jewish flesh living in the neighborhoods and regulated by the conciliar pronouncements of the church. That is, in a compressed form, one instance of what it looks like to say not only that the ideals of liturgical scripts and liturgical rites are not always realized, but also to say that the scripts and rites are themselves damaged, and that when they go wrong, they sometimes do so in characteristic ways. It would be possible to offer such an analysis, I think, of any liturgical rite, any practice of prayer, any practice of the church, icon kissing, hymn singing, confessing, lamenting. My interest in characteristic damage pointedly does not entail the claim that once we have identified things characteristic damages, we can somehow wholesale avoid them. Though it surely is the case that if we are on the lookout for damage that is characteristic, we might be able to avoid it sometimes. And it is also the case that seeing damages lets Christians know something about what we need to repent of and something about what we need to lament. But mostly, an account of characteristic damage just lets us see things clearly. I offer this analysis because I love the Eucharist, and if you love something, you should want to see the object of your love clearly. You should want to see not only its goodnesses, but its flaws. I think analyses of characteristic damage allow us to see, among other things, that Christianity is not wholly reducible to damage, but nor is damage wholly extrinsic to Christianity. In my own intellectual biography, host desecration was the beginning of my thinking about characteristic damage, but a second locus of church history that also prompted me to think along these lines was the history of slavery in the colonial and antebellum South. Frederick Douglass famously wrote that slavery could change a saint into a sinner and an angel into a demon. That seems true to me, but taken by itself, it seems like it can let Christianity off the hook. When one studies the Christianity that flourished in the colonial and antebellum American South, one sees many ways in which Christianity, including Christian liturgical practice, was deformed. And while it seems incorrect to say that Christianity is reducible to racism or slavery, it also seems incorrect to say that the deformations came wholly from slavery and are extrinsic to Christian practice itself. You'll notice some slippage in my language here. Am I saying that Christian practices are characteristically damaged, or am I saying that Christianity is characteristically damaged? I am saying both. Like Christian practices, Christianity itself is subject to the damage of the fall, and some of that damage is characteristic damage. Indeed, the depiction of the Eucharist's form and deformations I have sketched this afternoon is closely linked to an account of the form and deformations of Christianity itself. One way to describe Christianity's form is to say that Christianity is the extension of explicit relationship with the God of Israel to Gentiles through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. I would argue, I will not take time to work out the argument here, but I'll just posit the claim. I would argue that the deformation most deeply characteristic of Christianity is supersessionism. To put that differently, supersessionism is proper to Christianity. To say it is proper is not to say that it is necessary, and it is certainly not to say it is not deformed. It is rather to say that supersessionism shows us, through its very distortion, as through an old desilvered mirror, what one of the chief goods of Christianity is: explicit Gentile intimacy with Israel's God. And to say that the deformation is proper to Christianity is also to say that it's easy to miss, precisely because it is so closely intertwined with Christianity's essential goods. I would like to go back to ritualized faith for just a few minutes before we turn to questions and answers. Specifically, I want to go back to the argument in ritualized faith about liturgical reenactment. Once more, the argument of the book is that, in this chapter, is that often in the liturgy, the faithful are asked to, in some way, reenact an aspect of the core Christian narrative. When we do this, the book argues, the liturgy is giving us an opportunity to construct a narrative identity for ourselves, specifically by committing ourselves to the ethical and religious ideals of various biblical characters whom we reenact. The book gives various examples of this drawn from the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, moments where in the liturgy one enters into identification with Mary and Martha, or the prodigal son, or the thief on the cross. This theory of liturgical identification has given me a helpful way of thinking about one of my favorite moments in the Eucharistic liturgy. This moment appears in my own church's liturgy, the Anglican liturgy, and it appears in the Catholic Mass. I believe it does not appear in Orthodox liturgies, but I might be wrong about that. The prayer I'm thinking of is the prayer known as the prayer of humble access. And in the Episcopal liturgy, it is said right after the fraction, right after the consecrated Eucharistic wafer is broken, and right before the Eucharistic elements are distributed. One of the lines of the prayer is, "We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table." The prayer of humble access is a wonderful and strange prayer. It reminds Eucharistic practitioners whose worthiness and whose agency the sacrament entails, specifically not ours, but the Lord's. For 20 years, I have prayed the prayer of humble access and thought in general terms about the way that it fittingly chastens. I have also thought about how it's an uncomfortable thing to say, that I'm not worthy of crumbs from God's table, aren't I beloved of God, etc., etc. Why do I have to stand here and proclaim that I'm not worthy of crumbs from God's table when the scriptures make so clear that God delights in spreading feasts for us? I have thought about the way the prayer goes on to name mercy as proper to God. But thou art the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy. And how inside that claim of mercy, maybe it becomes apt rather than just uncomfortable to understand oneself as simultaneously beloved of God and not worthy to receive crumbs from God's table. Grant us, therefore, gracious Lord, so to eat the flesh of thy dear Son, Jesus Christ, and to drink his blood, that we may evermore dwell in him and he in us. The prayer concludes. But there's another set of things to see in the prayer. The prayer is an example of liturgical reenactment as sketched in Ritualized faith. That startling sentence, "We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table," puts in practitioners' mouths first-person appropriations of the proclamations of two characters from Scripture, specifically the centurion, who before asking Jesus to heal his servant proclaims, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof." And then the Syrophoenician woman, who having asked Jesus to heal her daughter, and having been told by Jesus that he won't because he only heals members of the people of Israel, and then to boot, he calls her a dog. After hearing that, the Syrophoenician woman proclaims, "Lord, surely even the dogs are worthy to gather up the crumbs from your table." We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table, my church prays. When we do so, we are quoting the centurion and the Syrophoenician mother. So this prayer, the prayer of humble access, is not just about our generic unworthiness. It is specifically about the Gentile church's unworthiness to receive gifts from the Savior of Israel, in this case, the gift of the Jewish flesh of Jesus. In other words, we can see the prayer of humble access as a moment of the liturgical rite's recursivity, a moment where the Eucharist recursively acknowledges its own potential deformations. The prayer is about the rite to which it belongs, and it shows, without removing, the Church's tendency to expropriate Jewish flesh rather than to accept it as a gift. That's what a characteristic damage account can show you about the prayer of humble access. But there is something that ritualized faith's account of liturgical reenactment has shown me about this prayer. When we liturgically reenact, we are being given by the liturgical script an opportunity to construct a narrative identity via our commitment to and identification with whatever biblical character we are quoting. When we pray the prayer of humble access, we commit to and identify with two Gentiles, the Roman centurion and the Syrophoenician mother. Identify with two non-Jews, saying to Jesus that we are not worthy of the God of Israel and that we cannot intimately commune with Israel's God. And then in the prayer, having remembered that God is merciful, we thus commune. Cuneo ends his book autobiographically, so I will end this paper autobiographically. One of the things that I have found strange about praying the prayer of humble access for 20 years is that I am not a non-Jew communing unworthily with Israel's God. I am a baptized Jew communing with Israel's God, unworthy to be sure, but not unworthy because of my gentility. The account of liturgical identification has given me a way to make sense of what I'm doing when I pray this prayer. In the midst of the rite that energized Christians' murders of thousands of Jews in medieval Europe, I am, for a moment, identifying myself with the Gentiles. In this prayer, I am, while yet remaining a baptized Jew, allowing myself to be liturgically remade into a Gentile of sorts, and recognizing that I cannot hold myself apart from the burden of the damaged Eucharists celebrated by the church that I have joined. I will stop there. We have 25 minutes for questions, and we have a microphone for questions. Thank you. So we are recording, and therefore, even if you think you have a great pulpit voice, I'm going to come to you with this microphone if you have a question or a comment or an answer to one of the questions I studied my paper with. Who would like to pose the first question or answer?
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm at PTS. I have a question. I love what you're doing, by the way. I'm writing on Thomas Aquinas and the moral formation of prayer, so this is really fun. But how would you know, for instance, when a practice is deformed and when it simply fails then to be the practice anymore? Like it's so deformed that it's simply not the thing anymore. So praying to have the persistence to club a baby seal is no longer a prayer. Thomas Aquinas would say, I'm actually just bad wishing. So I understand the desire to recognize that intrinsic to practices are evils that we ought to be aware of such that we don't continue them. But when do we cross a threshold where we're simply not doing the practice anymore?
Do you have an answer to that question?
I want to hear you.
I think that's a great question to which I must confess I don't immediately have an answer. Does anyone else have a wonderful, well-formed, shapely answer to that question? I think it's a really important question. I suppose that I come, and I'm not gonna stumble my way into an answer. I'm gonna appreciate that question for a while. But I will say, I do think that I have a pretty high bar for deciding that the thing is not the practice anymore. And specifically with sacraments, that high bar has to do with a strong need, I feel, to preserve the sacraments from any account of our own agency, that was an overstated claim. The need to preserve the centrality of the Lord's agency in an account of the sacraments. And then I think probably I would want to run that in a slightly reduced way through non-sacraments, that whenever we're doing something good, we're acting in cooperation with God, and it's not really, I don't know that it is really up to me to know if my prayer is so malformed that it's not a prayer. I think I don't trust my own capacity to know those things very much. So I might trust maybe others in my church community to name that for me. But I think I take so for granted that it's such a miracle when the non-damaged part of these practices presents itself that I'm just on the lookout for that. But this is not an answer to the question. Does anyone else have an answer to this really excellent question? Eric, are you going to answer the question for us?
Okay. Hi, I'm Eric. I have a sort of question that builds on it, that may lead to some form of an answer. So I like the way you talk about deformations that are intimate with the form of a good. But this is a kind of linguistic question, but I think it raises a theological question that analytic theologians have thought a lot about. You talk about deformations that are intimate with, and I like that language, but then you use the language of extrinsic to or intrinsic to, which invites claims about the nature of something, of a kind of ontological kind, but then you emphasize more the historical expressions and tendencies of these practices. You invoke the fall, but I assume by your language of not wanting to make something inevitable, you don't want to write tragedy into our experience of these practices as being necessarily deformed. So I'm just kind of, is it the practice, or is it we human agents and the things we bring to them that make these expressions characteristically damaged? Because the bigger question behind this is damage characteristic of creation itself in order to have these fragile, vulnerable practices? Now that raises a question that the Christian tradition on the whole has wanted to reject, because then it writes tragedy into creation, not just into our experience of the fall. So intimate with is good, intrinsic to, not incidental is okay, but I just worry about this. These are intrinsic to these practices, because that seems to be making a metaphysical claim that you might not want to be making, or maybe you do.
So what I don't feel like I have a very sophisticated answer to is the agency part of that question. I think speech about agency in these matters is complicated. And obviously, sometimes when we speak about practices, we're using that as a shorthand for the human agent of the practice. And yet, you know, we talk about buildings having bad effects on us, right? And is that a shorthand for the architects who built the buildings and the people who passed the tax codes that let those particular school buildings go to hell? Or are we actually making a claim about the building? In terms of creation, so, I mean, to me it seems clear that creation was not damaged. I mean, this is what the account of the fall gives us, right? It posits this space before damage came in. But I certainly would want to say that nothing now other than God, possibly Mary, and possibly Jesus' human nature, are exempt from that. And I do think we then get into the, you know, we get into the complicated landscape of Felix Culpa, and into the complicated landscape of, I mean, I think I would want to try to stay very closely to the indicative in my speech, that when God gives creation to creatures like us, what we will do is receive it in a damaging way. And, you know, one can think of some analogies for that. Like, there's a whole library of fairy tales that show that a perfect giver, some kind of magical sprite or fish or something, gives a perfect gift, a wish, to a creature who cannot help but receive it damagingly and do the wrong thing with it and damage that wish in the way he or she receives the wish. So I do think, to me, it seems axiomatic for Christianity to say human beings inevitably receive the gifts that God gives us damagingly. If a grandmother gives her 3-year-old a fancy porcelain figurine, the grandmother might be a perfect grandmother, the figurine might be perfect, the kid's gonna drop the figurine and break it and damage the gift. Now, one might ask, what kind of maybe this is not a perfect grandmother, what kind of grandmother is gonna do that? Like only a stupid or inattentive grandmother, or a grandmother who foresees that the child will respond to this by becoming the Michelangelo of porcelain in her generation, who can foresee a Felix Culpa. I mean, I think Felix Culpa is like a super weird, uncomfortable, uncomforting doctrine, but you can come up with like a Felix Culpa grandmother. Does that get at your question at all? No.
It raises the stakes whether it's fitting to these practices that intrinsically they have these possible characteristic damages.
Isn't it intrinsic to practices that have been damaged by the fall?
Well, I mean, it depends. Like Foucault, everything is bad, but that everything is not bad, but it's dangerous. So that's creating a space between intrinsic and tendency.
And I want to be clear that I don't think these practices, or any practice, inevitably goes in the way of its characteristic deformation. But I do think that they inevitably will sometimes go that way.
Thank you for your great talk. Here's my name is Myron, and I just appreciated your talk very much. So my question, I guess, is trying to get at the way in which you're separating good from deformed practices. And there are some rituals that are in some way practiced by Christians across traditions, the Eucharist for one. But there are lots of rituals in Christian communities that arise from unique, cultural circumstances. And I'm thinking of analyses of ritual from an evolutionary psychology or cognitive science of religion perspective, where what makes a ritual good and successful in a community is that it binds people together, lets people know who's on my team, and there's a lot of in-group, out-group kind of stuff that makes for a successful kind of ritual. So when it comes to Christian communities that practice rituals, for example, around a certain type of purity culture, practices in which young women are treated and kind of raised into a certain kind of sense of their own bodies, or ritual practices around, demon exorcism concerning conversion therapy for LGBTQ Christians, for example. Those are rituals that, from a cog-sci perspective, might be very effective because they are binding people together. They're definitely markers in terms of who's in and who's out. And I'm just wondering what your analysis of things that are proper to the ritual has to say about some of these practices that, from one kind of analysis, might seem successful, but at another kind of normative practice seem quite damaged.
So I think I would, off the top of my head, say 2 things about that. So sometimes I would want to regress the thing back. So it might be the case that purity culture is a characteristic damage of the Christian virtue of chastity. Maybe. I mean, I haven't worked it through. This is why I'm not an analytic theologian. I feel like then I need to go spend 2 years studying the details of the thing in some local community to know, but it seems like one could regress some of those things backwards, and that the thing that appears to be the damaged practice may actually be the expression of damage of some more sort of core practice. I think the question of these sort of social scientific goods of the practices is an important one, and it's something that makes me nervous, made me nervous in Ritualized Faith. It makes me nervous in all of the Hauerwas stuff about the Eucharist. It's one thing if we're talking about a practice that is not explicitly directed Godward. But when we are talking about liturgical practice, I just feel almost completely uninterested in a practice's capacity to like bind people together or like have some other good social scientific effect. And I would say about ritualized faith that it was striking to me, it's not that God was absent from the book, but that the Godward orientation of these practices seemed to me markedly downplayed. So I don't find a good social scientific outcome to tell me much of anything finally when I'm thinking about the landscape of liturgy and sacrament. But I tend to go too far in that direction, and I know that I do.
You have a congregation, and so if I may ask you to think in a practical way about this, can you, by way of a story, tell us how your thinking about liturgy and about how it becomes damaged or deformed, how has that affected your preaching? Have you ever, in the presence of your congregation, tried to illuminate for them how something has gone wrong? How might it become, in a very practical way, part of how you lead a congregation? That you have this awareness that is more illuminating than most of us have. We benefit from your insight.
I told my friend Sarah that I didn't know if this event was being recorded, and that if it was, I was not going to talk much about my church. And that if it wasn't, so in the reception, when we're not being recorded, right, the reception's not being recorded, I might talk in more detail about my parish. But let me see what I can think to say at the moment. I try to be pretty attentive. So I've been in this church for 5 years, this particular parish, which I think is just long enough to start knowing how to read it, how to read the congregation, how to read the parish. So I do try to be attentive to what I take the parish's characteristic inclinations toward damage to be. All congregations have them. I confess narcissistically that I probably spend more time thinking about what my own characteristic damages as a priest are, and here's one of them. I really don't like to do things that are going to make a headache for me. And because my best friend is nodding, my best Durham friend is sitting here nodding about all the times that, I don't like to make trouble for myself. I don't like to make a headache or a hassle for myself. So I think that I probably avoid doing some stepping into that congregation's characteristic damage that a better priest might not avoid, because I don't want to deal with the headaches. That's a really depressing thing to say, but there it is. Other friends of mine in the audience want to nod in agreement. Yeah.
I'm the friend from Durham, but I don't feel like I have to not talk about my congregation on video. So I will say that the Sunday after I read the prayer chapter in Characteristic Damage that talks about prayer trying to orient us towards intimacy and vulnerability with God, so we bring our deepest wants and our deepest longings to God in prayer. But then the deformity, being a characteristic deformity, being that like we feel like we can just ask whatever we want. This is getting to the comment that was made earlier. And then we actually get ticked at God when we don't get what we've asked for. The lectionary texts were about praying for what we want that Sunday. And so I work in a prison. My congregation is incarcerated. And so there was this direct and easy link. We were doing a prayer for healing service that Sunday. And this helped me immensely to be able to say to the congregation, I try to pray for what you ask me to pray for. I pray for your release dates to come quicker. I pray for things to go well for you in this place that is geared towards not you flourishing. I pray for your families to have food and wealth and success in ways that structurally they probably don't have a high likelihood of having this week. And all of these things have the risk and damage of us being so greatly disappointed that we pull back from God. And it was just a call and an ability to name something, but then also to say, let's not let, like, can we communally try not to let the risk get in the way of the good of intimacy? So that is one way that I have used this concept to preach.
Thank you. I'm glad you felt comfortable saying that on tape. Other questions? I'll go to the back. The back of the chairs.
Hi, I was just wondering, Jewel, sorry, my name's Jewel. I was just wondering about, especially in your accounts of the sacrament, what work you see grace doing and how that relates to these, ways in which sacraments and like the Eucharist are damaged. You were talking earlier, hinting at sort of your concern about not giving too much agency, for lack of a better word, to people when the sacraments are happening, and in some accounts of the sacraments, it's a guarantee, not a guarantee, it's a way in which grace has been promised from God, and so I was just curious about if you have thought about that within your accounts of the damage.
Yeah, I confess that the grace word is not a big word in my vocabulary, that maybe it needs to have a more prominent place, and I'm seeing Mike standing up, which must mean that we're supposed to end soon, for 5 minutes. So I do think, and this gets back to the question of how do we know when the practices aren't practices, that particularly, again, specific to sacraments, I would want to argue that there is grace present. I don't think that human beings are capable of damaging the thing enough to erase all of the possible grace. There's a super interesting chapter in Ritualized Faith that I would point you to about baptism, and it's an account of, it offers an account of how do we make any sense of the audacious claims of baptism for the remission of sin when it seems apparent that that actually doesn't happen? And I think that's an interesting and complicated question. So again, I think I would say the grace is present and we have limited, slow capacities to receive it in some pure way. That's not a very good answer. I'm not answering any of these questions very well, but I'm loving the questions. Next good question that I can't answer well. Joe.
Thanks very much for the great paper. So I wonder if the Eucharist persists eschatologically, and second, is there still a characteristic damage proper to it in its eschatological state?
I hope that there is no characteristic damage in the eschaton. I think if there's you're not at the eschaton if there's still characteristic damage or any damage, right? So I think there's a judicious and healthy debate about whether there is a Eucharist in the eschaton, and I suppose that debate can be reduced to whether you think there is anything new in the eschaton or not. If you're a farther up, deeper in person, then yes, it seems to me that we are, the heavenly banquet is the celebration of the Eucharist. If you are there is nothing new, we are permanently in a state of beatific vision, then I suppose there isn't one, and I suppose one would say the need for the Eucharist has gone away because the Eucharist is supposed to make possible a kind of intimacy that isn't possible here, etc. So when I picture the eschaton, not that I've worked this out in any sort of formal way, I like to have a Eucharist, but I also like to have autumn. And it's really hard to figure out how you have autumn if you have the cosmos healed of death. I do think, yeah, I'll stop there. So in my heaven, which sits somewhere between the gates ajar, the great 19th century depiction of heaven that looks just like earth below, and perfection, and we're just boredly having a beatific vision. In my eschaton, there's a Eucharist, but I'm not sure that I'm right. I'm going to claim that I know that that is speculative and maybe not right. Any other questions?
My name is David, and you mentioned early on how practices promoted racism, and I was wondering if you could give us some examples, perhaps along the lines of slavery you probably mentioned. What kind of practices would engender that? Because it may still be going on, and we ought to be aware of that.
Good question, which we could devote like years, I think, to answering. I'll just answer briefly with reference to the Eucharist, since that's what we've been talking about. In the context of the American South, there are lots of examples of Eucharistic and baptismal liturgies being re-choreographed to, I'm thinking here of the 18th and early 19th century South, re-choreographed to both pander to and reproduce the sense of slave owners that they don't want to be receiving the Eucharist with their enslaved people. In my own area of original study in 18th century Virginia, there are really fascinating accounts of Anglican clergy who are committed. So first of all, there's a debate about whether enslaved people should be baptized at all, but that debate basically gets settled in the 17th century. And there are these Anglican clergy who are really committed to baptizing enslaved people, but the owners of these people simply won't abide their having those baptisms happen like together in church. So there are two strategies that emerge in the colonial South. One strategy is that the elite white people just start having their baptisms at home. So they are rituals that get deformed by not actually like ritually staging entrance into the church. It becomes a ritual that just like reifies your entrance into your white elite family. And then another solution was pastor or priest who would like hold two separate baptismals, like Baptism Sunday would come around, they would hold a second service after the service for enslaved people to be baptized. So I think that we don't have examples that are quite that pronounced and egregious in our own day, but I certainly think we can look at all kinds of things in the way that we script our liturgical practice that communicate insider-outsider status. And I think, and a great book on this is Mary McClintock Fulkerson's and Marcia Mount Shoup's A Body Broken, A Body Betrayed, which is exactly about sort of Eucharistic practice, supposed color blindness. Thank you, Jenny. And I would also say in my own little neck of the woods, the Episcopal Church, there is still some persistence of like a desire for a private baptismal service. And that may not be motivated specifically by racism, but it's motivated, it might be of course, but it's motivated by some desire to like mark the baptismal body in a way that you select and cherry pick who the people are. And I think that's contrary to what the right wants to do. So we have a reception next door. It's a great reception. I've been to it before. I hope that you come. I'll be happy to talk lovingly and in a detailed way, lovingly about my parish with you at the reception. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you next door. And thank you, Mike.